So on Thursday the 27th of January 1966, Detective Sergeant Ron Blight with Detectives Peter Vogel, Lloyd Brand, Mostyn Matters and Peter Tremblay started very early at the Glenelg police station. In fact, some of them slept overnight. They knew the station would be ground zero, and sure enough, by the time they got there, there was already a conga line forming by the general public that snaked its way out from the steps of the police station along Jetty Road. Also, the media was camped overnight. They were after a scoop. Who could blame them? 1,000 more or thousands more newspaper circulations, upward trend in radio and television ratings could equate to a bonus. The newspaper's first uncorroborated description hit the press by Thursday afternoon. Who was it? It was a blonde-haired, surfy type dude with hair of need of cutting. This morphed into a beachcomber type with unruly mop of bleached blonde hair. That description still permeates the media today. I mean, don't let a good story get in the way of the truth. He never had bleached blonde hair because it was uncorroborated. There were sensational headlines of fear, sexual pervert and sex maniac on the loose, new sex attack fears, lock your doors. This truly was the day Australia lost its innocence. Now back to the Glenelg police station. I was talking to Mostyn Matters and Peter Vogel many years ago. They had one phone line into the station and a few typewriters. They did have a few phones, but one phone line in and a few typewriters. So the interviews needed to be written down, typed up, discussed, compared, and they were looking for a corroboration. Overall, this was a very time-consuming process, and they were working between 14 and 16 hours a day. They were obviously very tired, very frustrated because of the information coming in was some of it was a little bit erroneous.
At Glenelg Police Station, Mostyn Matters and his detectives were overwhelmed by people phoning or coming in with reported sightings.
We were only a small outfit. There was only a sergeant and 4 detectives there. There was a queue out the door, They wanted to see us and for the information. And they all had to be interviewed.
I was talking to Bill Hayes about this, and he succinctly put it into context. And I quote, "Detectives like Mostyn Matters and the rest of the team at the time had no crime scene to give them any evidence whatsoever. It was 54 years ago, and the art of investigation had not developed to the point that it is today. They did not have computers or the like, just statements taken, statements compiled, compared, then indexed into boxes and prioritised by the officers, all while dealing with the Adelaide CIB and the media."
Have you any doubt whatsoever now that these were the Beaumont children? None whatever. Does the description that you were given this morning by the elderly couple of the man tally with previous descriptions? Yes, in almost every detail.
Police feared almost immediately that they were hunting a sex offender. Dozens of people were questioned, but no firm suspects emerged.
Now, by Monday, the 31st of January, the detectives clearly emphasised to the media the man at the beach had light brown hair and not blonde as reported in the papers. However, this only made page 2 of the local newspaper, bottom left-hand corner. So, the blonde hair in need of cutting was now embedded in the Australian psyche. We wanted a witch to burn at the stake, and what better than a mop-top, blonde-headed, long blonde-haired sort of surfy type dude. Excellent. That was your witch we wanted to burn at the stake. See, as I mentioned previously, in 1966, as you saw by the newspaper headlines, sex maniac, sex pervert. But what we weren't looking for, and I've mentioned this before, we weren't looking at members of the clergy. We weren't looking for the businessman or the entertainer or the scoutmaster, the uncle, the auntie or the swim coach, because our thinking was these types of people weren't capable of such a heinous crime. how times have changed. There really isn't it was never anything like a dirty old man existing. Maybe only in the movies like Fagin from the movie Oliver. He's a great actor, he's not a pedophile, I'm just giving you an example. But we certainly weren't looking for a Harry Phipps type individual, so they got off scot-free as long as we were looking for the blonde-headed surfy type dude, the hair in need of cutting. By Monday, a full corroborated description was released. He was thin to athletic build, slim. He was tan. He spoke with an Australian accent, and he was 6 foot to 6'1", light brown hair, brushed back, parted to one side, although there's a bit of conjecture there. He was early to late 30s, early 40s, blue bathers, white stripe down either side. He had with him pants, shirt, at the beach, plus a beach towel. Now the sketch artist. John Chismezia was the staff artist for the Adelaide News. Rumour got out he was drunk at the time and he didn't really know what he was sketching. That is not true. He was not drunk. I was talking to Mostyn Matters and Peter Vogel, who were at the station when he was there. They said he wasn't drunk. Now, according to the two detectives, or ex-detectives, Mostyn Matters and Peter Vogel, said they were at the station, they were with the news people, and they had the corroborator, they had the witnesses there that could help the sketch artist, John, draw a picture of this man. Now, they said that he had a few drinks across at the Pier pub, but he wasn't drunk. If he was, they wouldn't have used him. The newspaper wouldn't have used him. He was in the employ of the newspaper, and certainly when people say, oh, he was drunk, it was like, oh, he was all over the place. There's no way you would have used him to sketch the individual. So he sat with some of the eyewitnesses, and the original sketch, which you can see, if you Google it, you can see the outline. Now, some people have said, how could you come to any conclusion by looking at this? Well, let's go back. You're an artist. You're painting a canvas. The initial canvas is taking shape. So was this. Give it time. It was released to the press, just the outline, the sort of boxy sort of head. But it was not primitive, but it was early stages. And he was adding to it as he was working with the people that were at the beach that day that saw the man. And then it was developing. So now you see the last sketch that has permeated the media. Now, the guy from Broken Hill, who was down from Broken Hill with his family, he was a bit younger. He was down for the cricket test. He looked at the final sketch by John and he said, yes, that's a likeness. So, number one, John was not drunk and the final sketch was close to what the man looked like at Collie Reserve that fateful day.
In 1966, a police artist drew this image of the man witnesses saw speaking to Jane, Anna and Grant at Glenelg Beach.
He was about 6 feet tall.
Around the 6 foot tall, athletic.
Fair wavy hair, a longish face and a high forehead.
Bearing a close resemblance to the police sketch is this man, Harry Phipps.
It's startling, the resemblance in my mind.
A millionaire factory owner and father of two, Phipps lived close to both the beach and the bakery, where the kids bought themselves cakes and a pie for the man.
Considering it was a hand-drawn sketch, I don't think you could have got it closer had you been looking at Harry and drawn it.
Now, keep in mind, all the time, why they're interviewing all these people, the Adelaide CIB was at it.
Today is the 7th day that Jane, Anna and Grant Beaumont have been missing, and it's the 4th time that the police have searched this area of the Sandhills.
Initially, police thought there were three possibilities. The children had either been kidnapped, or were hiding, or they'd suffered a tragic misadventure like drowning or collapsing sand dune. Police volunteers scoured the beaches. It was the largest search in South Australian history.
Now, with Glenelg and the surrounding suburbs back in 1966, 65, the 60s, 1950s, there were rolling sandhills, not like it is today, of course. So the police cadets got together and they scoured for hours, for days on end, the hills, the rolling sandhills of the back of Glenelg. However, no trace of the children were found. Obviously not physical. So they were sort of, what had happened to these children? They also drained the Patawalunga. And as you can see here from an aerial photo, you can see that they call it the Pat. They completely drained that. And of course, they had police officers go through that using sticks, and they were getting up and down in the mud. It was knee-high mud. No trace of the children had been found. They also thought that the children could have had a misadventure.
Stormwater drains and sewers were opened and flushed.
You did lead the men this morning to this inlet into the manhole in the Broadway.
That's true.
Now, do you believe that the children are in this pipe? Do you think that there's possibility they could be there?
No place was left unsearched. The local boat harbour was drained, a massive operation.
The Patawalunga Boat Haven in Glenelg, South Australia, in what is the latest development and perhaps the most dramatic one yet. The haven is going to be drained and the police will then inspect it.
And with the sand hills, they could have dug a cave, a side cave, or sand cave as they call, and it collapsed in on them. Now, my parents, I always remember this, they said never dig a sand cave in the side, it will collapse on you. And that frightened me, and it would have frightened quite a lot of other kids. Also, detectives went around the Glenelg suburbs, or close to Glenelg, and they were doing door knocks. They looked into the backyards, they talked to residences, but no trace of the children had been found. No trace of the children, apart from Collie Reserve, had been seen, or the last time they were seen was at Wenzel's Bakery. Even Ron Blight, the head of the station, he said basically, we are clutching at straws and we're a bit clueless about what we're actually looking for. Now, days morphed into weeks, morphed into months, and morphed into years. Now, Mr. Beaumont was visiting the station every day, but that became sort of every week. Because the press were camped outside their place, they decided to take the caravan, and that both of them escaped to the countryside. And we seem to forget that Mrs. Beaumont was holed up in her home for around about a month. So over the months, there was no new leads regarding this place. It really had everybody baffled. What happened to the Beaumont children? As Mostyn Matters has always said, and you hear this a lot, the children just vanished off the face of the earth. Well, the news, media is a big plus. Of course, they're after scoops and selling papers and radio ratings. Of course they are. But by October 1966, they decided we need to raise interest again in this case. So what did they do? Well, together with Con Pilates, who was a real estate tycoon, and you can still see the Pilates name along the shop or the side buildings of Glenelg, and you'll also see that in the centre of Adelaide. He was very wealthy. They got together and decided to bring across a clairvoyant from Holland. His name was Gerard Croissant. On a side issue, Mrs. Beaumont, we had heard, worked as a secretary for Con Pilates for some time. Now, Gerard Croissant, it did reach the papers and there was a lot of hoo-ha about it. And apparently, being a clairvoyant, he had solved cases like this before of people that have disappeared. However, what we find out later, that Gerard Croissant only had a 50% strike rate. What does that mean? It's no better than guessing what you and I could do. However, it did raise interest. They brought him across. He got picked up by the media. Now, he said that the children are buried at Paringa Park factory under the floor. It just got cemented in. So he said they're underneath there. He also went around to meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont. I mean, really, if you think about them, what did they have to lose? He met them, went across to the factory, they did the big dig, nothing was found, and as quickly as he came, Gerard Crescent went away.
In November 1966, over 9 months since they were last seen, a local businessman flew the famous Dutch clairvoyant Gerard Croiset to Adelaide.
Well, that was a farce. There's no two ways about that.
Croiset claimed he'd had a vision of the Beaumont children and arrived in Adelaide to a reception rivaling that given to the Beatles.
Do you hope that Dr. Croiset succeeds, Jim?
Oh, well, I mean, that's his belief, and I really appreciate him coming over, I mean, to find the children.
I think it'd be very difficult for him to meet us. I think he's a very feeling man, and I think that his main objective is finding the children more so than talking to us, perhaps.
Now, what did the detectives think of this, the Glenelg police station? Mostyn Matters said it was a load of crap and we wanted nothing to do with it. The Adelaide CIB also wanted nothing to do with it. The children weren't found. It did raise interest, and of course, once it raises interest, as Mostyn Matters would say, and Ron Blight, he said people would come to the station with their theories. The kids went off there, the kids went off there, they're living overseas, they got taken by some, white slavers, that came up, whatever that means. They're at Kangaroo Island. So they had a lot of conspiracy theories, but nothing substantial at all. They're all still scratching their head. Now, the detectives, some of them did move on from the Glenelg police station. Mostyn Matters moved on a few years later and he went to Darlington police station, not too far actually where the Mullins family lived at Seacombe Gardens. It was just up the road, and a few other detectives moved on. Ron Blight was still there, but who took over this case was at the CIB, and his name was Stan Swain. Now, Stan Swain had the gift of the gab. He was a good talker, and he rose the ranks of being a detective quite quickly. He was a smooth talker, and he sort of released things to the press he shouldn't have. He's going to be the man that solves the Beaumont case. We'll see. The start of Stan Swain's downfall was with what we call, in 1968, February 1968, there was a thing called the Dandenong letters. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont received a beautifully written letter in cursive writing, and it did look like it was written by Jane, basically saying they're with a man over in Victoria and he's looking after them very well, and he will deliver us back to you at the Dandenong post office. The Dandenong was about 30 kilometres, I think, south of Melbourne. Now, Mr. Beaumont looked at this, and it did look like Jane's handwriting, except the name Anna was misspelt. Now, he took it to Stan Swain. Stan Swain had a look at it and was very excited. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont thought that he had passed it on to his boss at the Adelaide CIB. But Stan didn't do that. Why? Because Stan was the man that was going to solve the Beaumont case. So what did he do? He organised Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont and himself to go across to Victoria, unbeknownst to his boss and also the media. It was very hush-hush, because if this comes to fruition, Stan Swain is a hero. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont quite liked Stan. He was a good talker and he had visited them previously, and he went this time with his wife and his children. The children still remember they were very uncomfortable, keeping in mind the children's bedrooms hadn't really been touched for ages, so they didn't really like being there. But Stan weaved his way into their life for some time, or for a short period of time. So across to Dandenong they drive. Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont were booked into a motel in Dandenong. However, the person that was owning or running the motel, he looked at Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont and he goes, "Well, I know you, I've seen you in the paper." So what do you think he does? He calls the media, also calls a police sergeant in town. Now the media are going, "Well, what is Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont doing there?" And then the policeman or the police sergeant also goes, well, what's Stan Swain doing here? Obviously something's afoot. So, of course, the media rushed to Dandenong. They're in hiding, of course, and they're waiting. So what does Mr. Beaumont do? There was a rendezvous, and it was at the Dandenong post office. Now, he was standing in front, waiting for this guy to turn up with the children. Where was Stan Swain? Well, he was incognito. He was actually acting, he was the window washer on the other side of the street. There was a phone call at the Dandenong post office. The person inside got it. They said, there's a man outside, I do need to talk to them. That man was Mr. Beaumont. She goes out, or he goes out, and says, look, the man has just called. He said he'll be there shortly. He's just running a bit behind time. Not too long afterwards, Mr. Beaumont's still there, hoping, just absolutely hoping that his children turn up. What parent wouldn't be hoping? Can you imagine? Probably not, because we haven't had 3 children or even 1 children disappear. But there was that hope that there might be something to that. The phone rings again. Another note comes out to Mr. Beaumont. Grant's not feeling well. You can see this unfolding. Grant's not feeling well. I'll be there later with the children. So as the hours went past, Mr. Beaumont's still there and realises the children aren't coming. Not only annoyed, but Stan Swain feels let down, but then Stan Swain realises that the press are in town, and he was pissed off. Where were the press? They gathered in the pub across the road. He went in and he basically said to them, and he did say to them, what are you bastards doing there? It was the press. What do you expect? They got wind of one of the biggest stories, if not the biggest story in Australian criminal history. Of course they're going to be there, Stan. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont are easily recognisable, and you hadn't told the CIB. What do you think happened? The shit hit the fan. It got straight to the CIB. Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont came home. They were also annoyed. They come home very dejected. Now, of course, Stan Swain's got to meet Knockalinton, CIB Adelaide, and you can imagine the berating Stan Swain got. And this hit the Adelaide papers also. This was the start of the demise of Stan Swain. He became so obsessed with this case. He was going to be the man to solve it. Even after he retired from the police force, he went into private investigation, and again, his name would pop up in the press from time to time. And again, it was Stan Swain believes this with the Beaumonts, believed that with the Beaumonts. He was absolutely obsessed. And as Bill Hayes, private investigator who's involved in the looking into Harry Phipps, said that Stan Swain certainly, he was following every goddamn lead, no matter what, because he was convinced he was the man to solve the Beaumont children. Now, Alan Whitaker, who was the author of Searching for the Beaumont Children that was published in 2006, and myself had the opportunity to meet Stan Swain's second wife in Adelaide back in 2005. And she gave a very good overview while we're having a cup of tea. She said that Stan Swain, this engulfed his life, it destroyed their marriage and also his relationship with his children. In fact, he became a changed man because of this case, and he was never the same once he got involved. So after that, nothing. Now, over the 5 decades, yes, there have been some people raised to a person of interest. Of course, there's Harry Phipps, and he stands out, and he really does stand out head and shoulders above anybody else that's ever been presented in regards to this case. But also other individuals that have been raised to a person of interest have been Anthony Munro, Bevan Spencer von Einem, Arthur Stanley Brown, James Ryan O'Neill, and Derek Ernest Percy. Now, I've been thinking this deserves in itself another episode, and we'll cover those people and why myself and Bill Hayes can rule these individuals out for very valid and plausible reasons. And myself and Bill, we get asked this question many times, and why wouldn't you? what became of Jim and Nancy Beaumont? Well, over the preceding years, and according to Mostyn Matters, Jim was coming to the Glenelg police station, but over time that dissipated and he became quite sort of introspective. He didn't talk to many people. What they did over the years, they sold their Somerton Park home, they separated and then divorced, but still remain good friends. Now, speaking to Tom Patterson, I spoke with him with Mostyn Matters several years ago. Tom Patterson was the postman in the Somerton Park, Somerton, Glenelg South region for decades. And he said the suburb was never the same until there was a generational change and the passage of time. So what became of Nancy Beaumont? Well, she moved out of the Somerton Park home because they're divorced and they sold it, and she moved to a side street in Glenelg. Why is that? Because speaking to some people that knew Nancy said she never wanted to be too far away from where the children were last seen. Now, for many decades, she could be seen at the local Glenelg pub on Jetty Road. And she enjoyed a beer, who could blame her, and a play on the pokies. And at times when she drank too much, and as I said, who could blame her, the publican would put her upstairs or place her upstairs free of charge with accommodation. Now, about 2010, 2012, Mostyn Matters and Diane Matters visited Nancy Beaumont at an aged care home where she was placed. Now, with Diana is full of life and she's a real talker. Well, she had met Mrs. Beaumont on the local bus when they were taking the bus from Glenelg into the city or around the suburbs, maybe to the large Marion shopping centre. She introduced herself to Nancy that she was Mostyn Matters' wife, and she was very happy to meet her, and they began a friendship. So with Diana, she had called the aged care home and asked if they could come and see her, and of course they could. Now, when they went to visit her, Nancy Beaumont was very happy to see them, especially Diana. I mean, I remember talking to Mostyn and said, really, I took a backseat. I didn't have much to say because of these two talkative ladies. And so when they went into this room, they said the room was very stark. They had a TV, it had a desk and it had a bed. And the first thing they thought was, surely the South Australian government could have provided better accommodation maybe at that aged care home. Now, the aged care home, the people were lovely and it was a nice aged care home. They just thought she deserved a better room, and surely the South Australian government would be able to give her one. Anyway, they were talking for ages and she had a locket around her neck. And at one point she opened the locket and said, "They're my children." And that was, of course, Jane, Anna and Grant. And she said, "Aren't they beautiful?" And Mostyn Matters and Diana agreed, but that was all. They didn't go on with it. What they did say, that Nancy seemed to be in a good place and in very good spirits. So with that, they were happy that she was happy, considering she'd been living a nightmare for 5 decades, but overall, right then when they met her, so they said she was in a good place. Nancy Beaumont passed away in 2018, and of course she's gone, well, as far as I'm concerned and many other people, she's there to meet her children again, and she's now truly at peace. Unfortunately, Diane Matters also passed away in 2018, and she is sorely missed. She had a lot of energy, very talkative, and always incredibly positive lady. Now, what happened to Jim Beaumont?
Well, what can you say at this moment? I mean, we've been hanging on for 9 months and 14 days now, and, well, we just got to wait and hope and pray.
Well, he moved to Glenelg South on the corner of the Broadway and Ramsgate. The Broadway is actually the main road of Glenelg South, and Ramsgate Street. And sometimes you could see him sitting on the chair outside his unit under the rays of the sun having a nice cup of tea. You could also see him from time to time at the Broadway pub just up the road, about 100 metres. And he'd go in, he'd buy a beer, sometimes he'd have a bet on the horse, and he would buy a 6-pack of beer and he would go home. He pretty much kept to himself. Now in 2015, when the first dig begun at the back of the cast alloy factory, Mostyn Matters went around to visit Jim Beaumont. And Jim was very happy to see him, and he said, as Mostyn, and this is from Mostyn, he said, I was talking to him, what do you think about the dig? He got the impression that Mr. Beaumont his hopes had been raised and dashed, so he kept a very level playing field. But he said he's very appreciative of what Bill, Stuart and Alan Whittaker have done. And that was good enough, because Mostyn called me and said that he was appreciative. Anyway, he stayed, he had a cup of tea with him, and Jim Beaumont was very happy to see Mostyn after many years. 2018, Steve, let's just call him Steve P. He is a tradesman in the Glenelg area and very popular. He's a painter, he's a handyman, very well known, very well liked. He knew Mr. Beaumont because he had done some work for him previously on many occasions over the years. He visited Mr. Beaumont just before the 2018 cast alloy digs, where a lot of the press, even from around the world, were honing in on these two boys, Robin and David, that said they dug a pit at the back, or the grave-size hole in their words, at the back of the factory 3 days after the children went missing in 1966. Steve went to visit him, and again the same thing. He felt like that Mr. Beaumont again was over it all, that his hopes had been raised and dashed. But again, he said the same thing. He was very appreciative of what Bill and Stuart and Alan Whittaker to a lesser extent were involved, and he was very happy with it. And Steve could see that he gave the okay. Steve called me actually and said, I visited Mr. Beaumont and he is happy with the work you guys are doing. So that gave us a lot of encouragement to keep going. Now Steve, and I'm just this is a sort of a byproduct, Steve is also in the Saturn Man book, Uncovering the Mystery of the Missing Beaumont Children, because he is one of another 3 that took the Saturn out of Harry Phipps's home when he was put into aged care. Him and his mate, a tradesman mate, were asked by Daisy Phipps or Elizabeth Ward, who also knew them because she had used them as tradesmen, to come and take a whole shitload of satin out of the attic. There was rolls of satin. There was yellow, lime green, green, purple, orange and red. There was rolls of it, and also a hell of a lot of dresses. Now even he said, and I know I'm going on a bit here, but even he said these dresses were for somebody quite tall. Now considering Daisy Phipps or Elizabeth Phipps wasn't that tall, and neither was Olga, his previous wife, his former wife who'd passed away, is that who were the dresses for? Well, obviously they were for Harry Phipps. And he said he hadn't seen so much satin in his lifetime, and it took him a few carloads to take it away. That was Steve. Where is Jim Beaumont now? Well, he moved into an aged care home I would say about 3 years ago, or even 2 years ago. He's now well into his 90s, and they're looking after him at the aged care home. And again, he has lived a nightmare that nobody wants to live for over 5 decades. And because of that, that's what keeps myself and Bill Hayes honing in on Harry Phipps, because it's our belief that he is highly likely involved in the abduction of the Beaumont children. So that's about it of the episode, what happened the days, weeks, months and years after the Beaumont children disappeared from Collie Reserve, Glenelg in January 1966. Well, that about wraps up this episode. Do make a comment, because I will try to get back to as many comments as possible. I'm quite sure a lot of people, especially with the Beaumont case, have a lot of differing opinions. Also, you can click the links below Instagram, Facebook, and go to the website thebeaumontchildren.com.au. So I'm Stuart Mullins. Until next time, I really appreciated your company.